There are moments in history, quiet, unexpected moments, when the powerful and the ordinary collide in ways that reveal far more than the participants ever intended. Today's story begins with one of those moments. Picture a small, quiet American town, the kind where the police station sits across from a row of faded storefronts, where officers move with a certain confidence that comes from believing they know everything and everyone in their jurisdiction. This is the kind of town where a traffic stop is routine, where officers rarely question whether the person they are speaking to might be someone whose authority far exceeds their own. And it is in this unassuming setting that a group of officers made a mistake so profound, so irreversible, that their careers would effectively end within minutes, all because they thought a black woman was talking back, all because they didn't know who exactly they had placed in handcuffs. Welcome to Swift Tale, the channel where stories of power, justice, arrogance, and accountability unfold in gripping detail. If you are visiting for the first time, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And let me ask you a question to start us off. Have you ever seen a situation flip completely upside down in an instant? A moment where the person being mistreated turns out to be the one individual the aggressors should never have crossed. If not, you're about to witness a story that demonstrates just how quickly ignorance can dismantle authority, and how a single phone call can echo through a police department like a thunderclap. Today's episode is the astonishing story of how several officers, acting with misplaced confidence, handcuffed a black woman they believed to be disrespectful, unaware that she was not just a respected service member, not just a leader, but a United States general, a woman whose rank demanded a level of respect and protocol they never bothered to consider. In their eyes, she was simply someone who questioned their tone, someone who dared to assert her rights. Someone they believed they could intimidate, but the moment she uttered 7 fateful words, "I need to make one phone call," everything changed. Because that phone call didn't go to a friend, it didn't go to a family member, it went straight to the Pentagon. Before we dive into the details, you need to understand why this story matters. Incidents like this are not just about ego or misjudgment. They reveal the broader issues embedded within systems of authority, the racial biases that shape interactions between police and citizens, the assumptions officers often carry, and the dangerous confidence that comes from believing someone has no power. It highlights a hard truth that many Americans, especially Black Americans, know far too well. Respect from law enforcement often depends on assumptions about who you are rather than the reality of who you are. And in this case, those assumptions didn't just lead to disrespect. They led to careers unraveling at the speed of a phone signal bouncing from a small-town police station to Washington, D.C. This story is more than an incident. It's a reflection of a system struggling with accountability. It exposes the uncomfortable fact that even the highest-ranking individuals, those who have dedicated their lives to serving their country, can become targets of disrespect simply because of the color of their skin. It forces us to ask why officers who are trained to observe, assess, and act with professionalism could so quickly abandon those principles when confronted with a black woman who dared to speak firmly, why questioning an officer's attitude is often interpreted as aggression, why demanding respect is labeled as being non-compliant, why authority figures instantly become defensive rather than reflective when their conduct is challenged. But what truly elevates this story from a local incident to a national conversation is the power dynamic that follows. Because what happens when officers who believe themselves to be in control suddenly realize they are far, far out of their depth? What happens when the woman they dismissed as mouthy turns out to outrank every law enforcement official in their entire county? What happens when chain of command, a principle the military treats as sacred, collides with the unchecked confidence of a small-town police force? You're going to hear how embarrassment gave way to panic, how bravado melted into fear, and how the officers' attempts to maintain authority crumbled the moment they learned the truth. You'll learn about the phone call that triggered a cascade of communications through military channels, reaching individuals whose names carry national weight. You'll hear about the frantic calls made by local leadership as they tried desperately to undo what had already been done. And you'll understand how this simple traffic stop became a lesson in humility, professionalism, and consequences. This introduction sets the stage not just for a story of wrongdoing, but for a story of reversal, a story where the person handcuffed holds more authority, more power, and more responsibility than anyone else in the room. A story where justice doesn't wait for a courtroom, but arrives through the chain of command in real time. A story where respect, denied at first, is demanded and delivered with the full weight of the United States military behind it. So settle in. What you're about to hear is a tale of misjudgment colliding with rank, arrogance confronting reality, and power shifting hands in a matter of seconds. This is the story of how a black woman general was handcuffed for talking back, and how one call to the Pentagon vaporized the careers of the men who made that catastrophic mistake. Welcome to Swift Tale. Let's begin. Before the events of that unforgettable day, before the officers' arrogance collided with a force far greater than they ever imagined, there was the woman at the center of it all, a figure shaped not by privilege or luck, but by grit, brilliance, and unwavering discipline. To understand the gravity of what happened, you must first understand who she was long before she found herself on the side of the road, questioned and belittled by officers unworthy of her patience. Her story is not just about rank. It is about the extraordinary journey of a black woman who rose through the harshest corridors of the U.S. military, breaking barriers that once seemed impenetrable. She was born in a neighborhood where opportunity rarely knocked, where success wasn't handed out but fought for. Her childhood was marked by challenges that would have crushed many: lack of resources, community struggles, and the constant pressure to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. Her mother used to tell her, "You don't get to blend in. You have to shine so brightly they can't ignore you." And shine she did, even as a child. Her teachers noticed her ability to command a room, not through intimidation, but through presence. She possessed an early blend of sharp intelligence, calm focus, and unshakable composure that hinted at the leader she would one day become. By her teenage years, she had already outgrown the limitations of her environment. She devoured books about world history, strategy, leadership, and politics. She joined every academic team she could find, not for recognition, but out of genuine hunger to understand how power worked. She excelled in math and engineering, subjects many struggled with, yet she glided through them with discipline and curiosity. It didn't take long for her guidance counselor to suggest the military, not as an escape, but as a challenge worthy of her ambition. She enrolled in a military academy where competition was fierce and expectations were sky-high. The academy wasn't built with people like her in mind. Black women were few, and black women who aimed for the highest ranks were almost unheard of. She was underestimated from day one. Some cadets assumed she wouldn't last a semester. Others thought she had been admitted only to check a diversity box. But as the months passed, she proved that not only did she belong there, she excelled. She became a top cadet in both academics and leadership. Her instructors noted her exceptional ability to maintain composure under pressure, her talent for strategic thinking, and her natural instinct to lead without demanding attention. As she progressed through her military career, she earned respect the hard way through action, discipline, and a record of flawless performance. She led missions, handled crises, and managed teams with a quiet authority that made people want to follow her. Where others raised their voices, she raised standards. Where some relied on intimidation, she relied on integrity. Her service record quickly became a model example of professionalism and honor. She climbed from lieutenant to captain, from major to colonel, and finally to the distinguished rank of general, a rank carried by less than 1% of military personnel and held by even fewer women of color. Her rise was not without battles. She faced subtle bias, open skepticism, and moments when people in the room doubted her abilities before she even spoke. But she learned to navigate those obstacles with the same patience and strategic mind she applied to her missions. She refused to let prejudice define her pace or her ceiling. She understood early on that leadership meant being calm under pressure, even when the pressure came from those who should have known better. By the time she reached the rank of general, she had become more than a military leader. She was a symbol. She represented excellence forged through perseverance. She symbolized authority earned through merit, not connections. She carried the weight of history on her shoulders, knowing that every achievement she earned opened doors for the women coming behind her. She became an admired figure within the Pentagon. a soft-spoken but powerful presence known for her strategic mind, her meticulous planning, and her ability to make tough decisions without losing her humanity. Her reputation extended far beyond the walls of military bases. Within government circles, her name carried weight. Her advice during crises was sought by top officials. She was known for her calm under pressure and her ability to defuse conflict simply by entering a room. She had led disaster relief efforts, negotiated complex intelligence operations, and even mediated between conflicting agencies when communication broke down. In short, she was someone whose rank was matched only by her competence. And perhaps most telling of all, she was respected by those who genuinely understood the military. She was addressed with her rank not because protocol demanded it, but because people wanted to. She had earned every salute, every acknowledgement, every seat at the table where national security decisions were made. Yet on the day of the incident, none of this mattered to the officers who confronted her. They didn't see the years of sacrifice, the thousands of personnel she had mentored, the medals on her uniform, or the missions she had commanded. They didn't see the leader who had spent decades serving her country with unwavering dedication. They saw only what they wanted to see, a black woman who dared to question them, a woman they dismissed before she even finished speaking. A woman they believed they held power over. But the irony and the tragedy is that she held more authority, more responsibility, and more influence than the entire police department combined. She outranked everyone in their building. Her chain of command reached the Pentagon, and her status in the military wasn't just ceremonial, it carried real weight, legal protections, and protocols those officers grossly violated. This is why her background matters. It is not merely a biography, it is the foundation that makes the incident so shocking, so unjust, and so consequential. Because when officers treated her with disrespect, they weren't just insulting a citizen. They were disrespecting a general of the United States. And when they handcuffed her, they didn't just detain a woman, they violated protocol surrounding one of the highest-ranking military officers in the country. And all of this, the decades of sacrifice, the earned respect, the extraordinary leadership, is exactly what made their arrogance so catastrophic. Long before the general's fateful encounter with the local police, the town where everything unfolded had already built a quiet reputation, one whispered about by residents, shrugged off by officials, and buried beneath the kind of small-town charm that outsiders often mistake for safety. This was the sort of place where the old brick buildings leaned slightly, where the diner on the corner served the same breakfast specials for 20 years, and where neighbors knew each other's business before it even became business. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect facade lay something far less idyllic, a police department shaped by complacency, insulated by tradition, and emboldened by a history of unchecked authority. The town had a long-standing culture of our way or no way, a mindset that filtered through everything from local politics to the everyday interactions between officers and citizens. Most of the police force had grown up in the region. Many were second- or third-generation officers who inherited not just badges, but attitudes, some helpful, some harmful, and some outdated long before they ever pinned on their uniforms. The department often prided itself on being old school, which in practice meant resistant to change, resistant to accountability, and resistant to any behavior that challenged their perception of control. For years, the town's leadership had allowed the department to operate with near-total autonomy, trusting them to keep the peace without asking too many questions. But to the town's black residents, the police force had always carried a different reputation. Stories circulated quietly at barbershops, family gatherings, and church meetings, stories of unnecessary stops, disrespectful interactions, and officers who escalated minor issues into confrontations simply because they could. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns. Small, persistent patterns that grew into a kind of collective understanding. You obey, you comply, and above all else, you do not talk back. Any sign of confidence or assertion, even polite questioning, was often met with suspicion or hostility. Yet despite years of complaints, very few consequences ever followed. The department had seen its share of controversy. A few years back, there had been a case involving a young college student pulled over for a broken taillight, a simple stop that spiraled into a rough arrest over non-compliance. The story made local news, but the officers involved were cleared of wrongdoing after an internal review. Another incident involved a veteran stopped for speeding who said he was treated like a criminal when he tried to explain he was having a medical emergency. And then there was the local business owner, well-respected, well-known, who filed a complaint after officers entered his shop without cause and spoke to him with unnecessary aggression. The city council had promised reforms, but nothing meaningful ever happened. To outsiders, these incidents were minor. To locals, they were red flags waving in a wind no one of authority bothered to acknowledge. And the officers involved in these cases, they were the same type of officers who made national news for the wrong reasons, overconfident, undertrained in communication, and deeply protective of their authority. The type who took questioning personally. The type who saw calm firmness as disrespect. The type who escalated simple conversations into confrontations because their temper, not their training, set the tone. At the heart of the department was a culture that valued loyalty over accountability. Officers covered for one another, defended one another, and rarely challenged one another. The chief, an nagging man who had spent his whole career policing the same 5 miles of town, believed strongly in the idea that questioning the department meant disrespecting the badge itself. Under his leadership, discipline was rare and self-reflection even rarer. He trusted his officers, often to a fault, and he dismissed community complaints as exaggerations from people who didn't understand police work. Within this environment, officers developed a sense of unchallenged authority. They were used to being the final word, the unquestioned voice in any encounter. They were used to citizens deferring, apologizing, shrinking under their tone. They were used to people not knowing their rights, or if they did, being too afraid to assert them. So when someone didn't fit that script, when someone asserted themselves with calm confidence or challenged their behavior with dignity, these officers didn't know how to respond. They interpreted strength as defiance. They saw confidence as a threat, and in their minds, questioning them was the ultimate act of disrespect. The officers who would eventually handcuff the general were no exception. They carried themselves with a firmness that wasn't earned through professionalism, but through habit built from years of getting their way without pushback. Their reports were rarely questioned, their behavior rarely scrutinized. Citizens feared them, but not because they were effective protectors. They feared them because they were unpredictable. What started as a routine stop could turn into an arrest if an officer felt disrespected. A word used often in the department, almost always subjectively, and conveniently wielded during moments when an officer's ego outweighed their judgment. In this town, badges often replaced boundaries, and the officers believed that asserting their authority meant never backing down, even when they were wrong. This mindset wasn't just dangerous, it was volatile. All it needed was a spark. All it needed was someone they thought they could intimidate, someone who would push back against their tone, someone who would not cower, apologize, or shrink. What they didn't realize, what they never could have imagined, was that the next person they chose to challenge, the next person they attempted to silence, the next citizen who refused to be disrespected, was someone they should never have crossed. Someone whose authority towered over theirs in ways they did not understand. Someone who had spent her entire life earning a level of respect they could not begin to fathom. A general, a leader, a woman who outranked not just them, but everyone in their chain of command. In a town where officers had grown accustomed to unchecked dominance, they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget, one that would cost them their jobs, their reputations, and their futures. And it all began on a quiet day, on a quiet road, in a quiet town that had no idea how loud the fallout would become. The day of the incident began like any other, calm, predictable, almost deceptively ordinary. It was the kind of day no one would remember if not for what happened next. Clear skies, a warm breeze drifting across the town's narrow streets, and the steady hum of life moving at its usual slow rhythm. For the general, it was supposed to be a simple, uneventful trip. She wasn't on official military business, wasn't traveling in uniform, and wasn't accompanied by the entourage or security detail that often followed high-ranking officials. She preferred it that way. Whenever possible, she embraced moments of normalcy, time when she could slip quietly into the world without protocol dictating every second. That morning, she was simply passing through the town after visiting a retired colleague who lived just a few miles away. She had no intention of stopping, no reason to interact with the local authorities, and certainly no expectation that a routine drive would turn into a moment that would ripple through the ranks of law enforcement and the U.S. military. On the other side of town, the officers involved in the incident had started their day with a very different energy. They were already frustrated, complaining about paperwork, joking harshly about calls from the night before, and bickering about people who didn't respect the badge. Their patrol car sat tucked near a side street as they scanned traffic with the bored confidence of officers who assumed they'd seen it all. Their morning briefing had been routine, no major alerts, no serious crimes, just reminders about traffic enforcement and responding to calls promptly. Yet, for reasons no one could ever fully explain later, they seemed almost eager that morning, eager for action, eager for confrontation, eager for someone to give them an excuse to assert their authority. Fate, or perhaps inevitability, brought these two worlds together on a stretch of road lined with tall oak trees and fading road signs. The general drove steadily, lost in thought, as she reflected on the visit she had just made. She had spoken with her retired colleague about everything from leadership to upcoming military programs. It was one of those grounding conversations, the kind that reminded her why she served, why she sacrificed, and why she continued to push forward despite the obstacles she often faced, both within and outside the military. She carried that sense of reflection with her as she drove, calm and unhurried. The officers noticed her car not because she was doing anything wrong, but because she didn't fit the pattern they expected. A woman alone, not speeding, not nervous, not glancing anxiously into her rearview mirror, she didn't react the way drivers usually did when they spotted a police car. She drove with confidence, and to the officers watching, that confidence read, incorrectly, as attitude. They claimed later they stopped her for a minor issue, but it was clear from their initial comments that they had already formed a narrative about her before they even turned on their lights. When the flashing blue and red lights lit up behind her, the general was surprised but not alarmed. She pulled over calmly, expecting the usual brief encounter, perhaps a misunderstanding, maybe a minor issue with her vehicle easily resolved. She had interacted with police before, and her rank had never been something she flaunted. She believed in respecting law enforcement, just as she expected them to respect the people they served. She had no reason to anticipate anything unusual. No reason to imagine that a simple stop would soon become a test of composure, unlike anything she had faced in uniform. The officers, however, approached with an energy that didn't match the quietness of the day. Their posture was stiff, their faces set in expressions of authority sharpened by ego. Even before reaching her window, one of them muttered under his breath, already framing her as uncooperative simply because she hadn't reacted with fear. They walked with the swagger of men who expected compliance, not because they deserved it, but because they had grown accustomed to it. They didn't know her. They didn't recognize the quiet strength she carried. They didn't see the discipline in her posture or the composure in her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. All they saw was a woman who looked too calm, too confident, too sure of herself. As they approached, a few cars drove by slowly, glancing but not stopping. To them, it was an ordinary traffic stop, nothing more. But if they had looked closer, they might have sensed the tension already beginning to brew. They might have noticed the way one officer's jaw tightened, the way the other glanced at her license plate with suspicion. They might have realized that this was not going to be the kind of stop that ended with a polite warning and a "have a nice day." The first words spoken set the tone. The officer projected unnecessary authority, starting with a demand rather than a greeting. The general responded with calm respect, her voice even, her expression neutral. She asked a simple, reasonable question, one any citizen has the right to ask. But in that moment, that question, so small, so harmless, triggered something in the officers. They interpreted it as defiance. They took it personally. Unbeknownst to them, the woman they now saw as challenging was someone whose voice regularly addressed rooms full of decorated commanders, someone trained to de-escalate international crises, someone who maintained composure during military operations where lives depended on her decisions. But here she was, forced to navigate an encounter shaped not by protocol or professionalism, but by the fragile egos of two officers who didn't understand the difference between respect and submission. What makes this moment so striking is how avoidable it was. Had the officers approached with courtesy, had they listened, had they set aside their assumptions for even 10 seconds, the day would have ended quietly. But instead, their need to dominate, their irritation at being questioned, and their complete ignorance of the woman before them steered the encounter toward a collision that would reshape their futures. As the conversation grew tense, the general felt the shift immediately. She sensed their rising hostility, noted their puffed chests and clipped tones, and realized she was no longer dealing with professionals enforcing the law. She was dealing with men who viewed her calm as a threat. Still, she held her ground with dignity, unaware that this moment was only the beginning of a chain reaction that would stretch from this quiet roadside to the highest levels of the Pentagon. This was the day the officers chose the wrong person to challenge. This was the day their routine power play would backfire. This was the day that would change everything. What began as a tense but still manageable standoff quickly warped into something far more volatile inside the precinct walls. The moment General Amara Cross, calm, composed, hands visible, was led through those reinforced glass doors, the atmosphere shifted from public confrontation to unrestrained authority. Outside, cameras were watching. Inside, the uniformed men felt shielded. The supervising sergeant attempted to reclaim control of the narrative by directing the junior officers to process her with urgency. That single phrase, delivered with clipped irritation, fueled a sense of desperation. A woman they thought was just another citizen had exposed their unchecked arrogance, and the realization that she was far from ordinary gnawed at them. The detention room grew aggressively cramped, not physically, but psychologically. The younger officer, still flushed with the embarrassment of being corrected in public, insisted she be handcuffed again, this time behind her back, despite her wrists already swollen from the initial restraint. Each time she calmly reminded them of protocol, they reacted as though she were challenging their authority. It wasn't her words that ignited them. It was her composure, her knowledge, and her refusal to shrink. They were not dealing with an uninformed civilian. They were dealing with a decorated commander who understood federal chain of command clearer than any of them did. The sergeant barked orders that contradicted constitutional procedure, yet no one under his command dared intervene. The unspoken rule in that room was ancient. When authority is threatened, force replaces reason. But General Cross didn't raise her voice, didn't plead, didn't panic. Instead, she observed, memorizing badge numbers, faces, tones. Even pauses between instructions. Although no one knew it yet, she was mentally drafting a sequence of events that would later unfold in Pentagon-level review. That room felt like a cage to them, but to her, it was evidence collection. When one officer attempted to confiscate her phone and military ID without logging either into property records, she calmly warned him aloud that unauthorized seizure of federal identification would trigger an automatic misconduct alert through the Department of Defense system. Her tone was steady, factual, unthreatening, but it landed like a detonation. Silence fell, not because they respected her, but because they feared verification. The sergeant, jaw tight, ordered everyone to continue regardless and demanded she stop acting like she outranks the law. The irony was bitter. She didn't outrank the law, she outranked them. What they saw as talking back was in reality federal protocol. What they saw as defiance was lawful objection. What they believed was insubordination was simply a senior military official reminding them that badges do not grant license to abandon training or procedure. The presence of hierarchy, and their sudden awareness of it, turned the room into a ticking arena of bruised ego and institutional fragility. Every move she made, every sentence she delivered with controlled precision, only deepened their fear of exposure. They had crossed a line, and even before she made the call, they sensed careers would snap under its weight. She sat in silence as they scrambled around her, not with the panic of someone detained unjustly, but with the patience of someone who had already calculated the ending. The real escalation wasn't her voice or her presence. It was their realization that this arrest wasn't going to disappear into paperwork. It was going to ascend, documented, reviewed, and judged by a command structure far above their precinct walls. The moment everything changed did not arrive with shouting, force, or dramatic struggle. It arrived with quiet authority, delivered through a single phone call. Up until that instant, the officers believed they could outmuscle, outtalk, or outintimidate the situation. They believed that if they barked loudly enough and pressed hard enough, the woman they had in custody would eventually fold under pressure like every other detainee who stepped foot inside their walls. But General Amara Cross was not every other detainee, and the precinct's illusion of dominance evaporated the second she requested her phone call, not with desperation, but with procedure. The supervising sergeant laughed when she asked for immediate telecommunication access, claiming she wasn't in any position to make demands, forgetting completely that federal detainment laws guaranteed her that right the moment she was processed. When she repeated the request, she did so calmly, citing military jurisdiction overlap when a commissioned officer is detained under suspicion absent criminal charges. This time, her language was different. It wasn't a plea, it was a briefing. And they felt the difference. The younger officer, still rattled from her earlier assertion of rank, shoved a departmental phone toward her. His intention was to look compliant but irritated, as though the call were merely a courtesy he was forced to allow. What he didn't realize was that this call was not going to internal affairs, not to a civilian attorney, and not to a city mediator. It was going to the United States Pentagon command desk. She dialed with precision, not hesitation, and when the automated secure routing system answered, stating, "You are accessing a restricted federal communications line. Identify," the room shifted. The sergeant, arms folded, smirk fading, suddenly became a student in a lesson he never agreed to attend. He heard the tone of the system, the very specific cadence that could only belong to high-clearance routing, and his posture changed, not outwardly at first, but internally. You could almost see the flicker of realization travel up his spine. He had misjudged this woman, misjudged her position, misjudged the consequences. General Cross identified herself with rank, clearance classification, and service branch code. The automated line confirmed her identity, then transferred her to Live Command support. No one in that holding office had ever heard such a thing, not in movies, not in training, not in real life. When the voice of the command duty officer came through, calm, controlled, impossibly steady, it was the sound of an institution wider than police jurisdiction, older than precinct authority, and infinitely stronger than badge-backed ego. "General Cross, confirmation of detainment received," the voice said. The officers froze. No one had reported anything. No external complaint had been filed. Yet the Pentagon already knew, already had the time stamp, already had the advisory. That meant that the moment her ID was run, a silent federal monitoring protocol engaged, one that local police didn't know existed and certainly didn't fear until right then. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't embellish, she didn't dramatize, she simply explained with factual clarity that she had been stopped without probable cause, detained despite formal identification, handcuffed despite compliance, and handled with force disproportionate to circumstance. She did not mention insult. She did not mention humiliation. She only presented the legal skeleton of what transpired, and that was enough. In military culture, emotion is unnecessary when truth is heavy enough. On the other end of the line, the duty officer asked a single question: "Is their commanding officer present?" It was not phrased with curiosity. It was phrased with expectation, as though protocol demanded that if a general was held in custody, the senior-most precinct official should have been informed before a single restraint was applied. Sergeant stepped forward, voice cracking ever so slightly, and announced himself with his title. Not rank, because in that room his badge number no longer commanded hierarchy. The duty officer requested badge numbers, incident codes, arrest justification, and audiovisual log timestamps. The room, once filled with the swagger of unrestrained authority, turned into a compliance seminar no one volunteered to attend. The sergeant tried to speak confidently, but the tremor in his breath betrayed him. His wording faltered. He attempted to reframe events as procedural detainment, but General Cross corrected him, not aggressively, not condescendingly, just accurately. "Detainment without charge," she clarified, "facts over theatrics." The Pentagon did not react emotionally, they reacted procedurally. And procedure, when applied with full weight, can feel like punishment. The duty officer informed them that the Inspector General's office, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and military liaison legal oversight would be initiating parallel inquiry. Parallel, that meant not one review, but three, not internal to their department, but external to their universe. While the sergeant tried to maintain composure, the younger officer stepped back, face pale, replaying each moment of contact. The handcuffs, the tone, the force, the assumption that she could be spoken to like someone beneath them. He replayed every second, not because he cared about morality, but because he could now see the outline of career termination forming like storm clouds over his future. Then came the sentence that shifted the air entirely. General Cross, for your safety and in recognition of rank, remain stationary. Federal Command is dispatching liaison personnel. The precinct had never, in its existence, been visited by military liaison in response to an arrest. And yet they were now on the way, not because she screamed, not because she resisted, not because she threatened, but because she requested a single phone call through the proper channel. She thanked the duty officer with the same calm tone she'd used all day. No triumph, no disdain, just dignity. The call ended. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence, it was realization silence. A silence made heavy by the knowledge that everything before that moment would be documented, dissected, archived, and judged. What terrified them wasn't punishment, it was inevitability. They could argue with lawyers, they could write narratives into reports, they could bend words into excuses, but they could not outrank chain of command. They could not outrank Pentagon oversight. They could not outrank someone who had devoted her life not to power, but to structured duty. What they called attitude, Federal Review would call lawful objection. What they labeled talking back, oversight would categorize as uniformed officer correcting breach of protocol. And when her phone rested on the desk, screen dark, she did not gloat. She simply sat, posture still, hands folded, not as a prisoner waiting release, but as a general waiting acknowledgement. In that room, authority inverted. The badges no longer carried weight, they carried liability. The officers who had once believed they controlled the narrative were now just witnesses in a federal audit. The sergeant stood still, no longer commanding the space, merely occupying it. And the younger officer, who hours earlier had approached her with bravado, now couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. Because respect, when forced, doesn't feel like respect, it feels like consequence. And consequence had just dialed in, confirmed identity, and put them on the clock. The precinct was never designed for silence, yet what followed after the Pentagon call was a silence so deep it felt architectural. No phones rang, no boots scuffed, no radios crackled. Even the fluorescent hum overhead seemed to dim. The officers, moments ago loud with command, posturing, and ego, now stood unsure of their own posture, shoulders drawn in, hands tight to their sides, not knowing whether to appear still, apologetic, or invisible. General Amara Cross remained seated exactly as she had been when the call ended, back straight, wrists resting gently atop her lap, gaze forward, unbothered. She looked less like a detainee and more like a woman waiting for a scheduled escort. She was not in custody, she was in transition. Outside, the first sign of change arrived not with sirens or military drums, but with the low, synchronized rumble of black government vehicles pulling soundlessly into the precinct lot. There were no flashing lights, no theatrical arrival, just controlled precision. The Pentagon wasn't coming to debate. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to collect, observe, and record. In military protocol, swift arrival is not dramatic, it's standard. Through the glass front doors, the sergeant saw them first. Two uniformed liaisons in formal military dress, followed by a third in dark civilian suit, the unmistakable insignia of the Department of Defense visible only if one knew what to look for. They moved not with the swagger local officers were accustomed to, but with purpose, neither hurried nor slow, just efficient in the way only trained federal personnel can be. The younger officer almost choked on his breath when he realized they weren't just military. They were high-level legal oversight, the kind summoned when protocol violations involve ranked officers. They didn't ask where to go. They didn't inquire who was in charge. They walked directly and confidently as if they had spent years studying the exact blueprint of this building. When the door to the detention corridor opened, General Cross finally lifted her gaze, not dramatically, not triumphantly, simply acknowledging their presence, like a commander greeting unit support. The lead liaison spoke first, voice level, clipped, entirely devoid of emotion. General Cross, we are here under directive authorization to transfer oversight. Not detain, not release. Transfer oversight, a phrase that stripped the precinct of every ounce of control they believed they had. The sergeant stepped forward, clearing his throat, trying to reassemble the dominance he had so casually displayed earlier. But dominance without legitimacy is just noise. He introduced himself again, this time with less edge, less bark, almost seeking recognition. The liaison did not shake his hand. Instead, he requested in the same neutral tone all incident reports, officer bodycam footage, detainment logs, and identification scans associated with General Cross. Not please, not when available, not if applicable. Oh. The sergeant fumbled. He began explaining unnecessarily, the kind of over-explanation men use when dignity is slipping and paperwork is about to weaponize truth. He described the stop, the command response, the detainment, the miscommunication. But military liaisons do not process narrative, they process facts. The liaison cut through his explanation with a single sentence. General Cross was not under criminal suspicion. Your authority ended at confirmation of her identification. It was the most polite dismantling of police ego they had ever heard. Body language shifted everywhere. The younger officer wished he could disappear into the tile. The administrative clerk at the computer suddenly realized she had witnessed what would become evidence. Even the camera in the corner seemed to shrink under the weight of impending review. General Cross stood. No restraints were removed because she had never needed them removed. She could have ordered that hours ago. Instead, she waited until the liaison signaled, and only then did she rise, an intentional demonstration of respect for chain of command that none of them in that room had shown her. When she faced them, these officers who had cuffed her, doubted her, dismissed her, there was no anger in her eyes, no smugness, no retribution, only clarity. The liaison requested a private briefing room, not as a suggestion, but as a directive. As they exited, one of the military aides paused beside the sergeant and delivered a line so quietly it sounded almost compassionate, yet carried the force of institutional finality. You may want to begin preserving statements. Federal oversight will request officer accounts individually. Individually, apart, no unified narrative, no collective story building, no time to align excuses. The door shut. Inside the meeting room, the liaison stood while General Cross sat, not out of deference to her, but because military protocol dictates that a general outranks everyone present unless otherwise specified. Her voice, when she began briefing them, held the same even tone she used all day. She did not dramatize events. She did not exaggerate harm. She did not lecture about racism or abuse of authority, even though both hung thick in the air. She simply laid out timeline, procedure discrepancy, and violations in precise order. What terrified the precinct most was not what she said, but what she didn't need to say. In federal review, the absence of complaint often carries more weight than emotional protest. Her restraint was her power. While documentation was transferred, the sergeant tried one last time to assert integrity. He approached the closed briefing door, paused, straightened his uniform, and knocked with 2 regretful taps. The liaison opened only enough for his face to be seen, not his presence to intrude. Is the general available to answer a clarifying detainment question? The sergeant asked, voice tight. The liaison responded, no clarifications are necessary. Your department will be informed of next steps through formal chain. Translation. You are not part of this anymore. The sergeant swallowed hard. He returned to the hallway where his officers watched him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Fear, because their careers now rested in the hands of people they did not know. And curiosity, because none of them had ever been this close to federal correction before. When the meeting ended, General Cross emerged, flanked by the liaisons, not guarded, not protected, but escorted with recognition. She did not look back, did not pause to glare at the officers, did not demand apology. She didn't need revenge to prove anything. Their futures were already redirected by her calm adherence to protocol. As she reached the exit, she made one final stop, not dramatic, not punitive. She simply turned to the desk clerk, the only one who had looked at her earlier with hesitation rather than hostility, and said, "Thank you for your professionalism under pressure." The room felt it. That sentence held both separation and closure. It acknowledged humanity where there had been so little. Then she walked out, her presence so controlled that even departure felt like command. The precinct doors closed behind her, but the echo of authority remained, not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. The vehicles rolled away without a siren, without spectacle, leaving the officers alone with the weight of consequence. Careers hadn't ended yet, but the process had begun. Not with anger, not with retaliation, with a phone call, a briefing, and the unshakable posture of a woman who did not raise her voice to be heard. She simply invoked procedure. And procedure at her rank was louder than anything they could yell. The moment the military convoy disappeared from the precinct lot, the building exhaled, but not with relief. It was the exhale of a collapsing structure, the sound of ego deflating and certainty dissolving into dread. Every officer who had been bold an hour ago now looked like someone waiting outside a courtroom, uniforms still crisp, badges still polished, but morale stripped to the studs. The sergeant returned to the main floor stiffly, not in command, but in shock. He didn't bark orders, didn't slam drawers, didn't perform authority. Instead, he muttered the words no officer ever wants to speak in their own precinct. Everyone needs to start writing. That sentence detonated deeper than any raised voice ever could. Write, meaning document, meaning timeline, meaning personal accountability. In most precincts, reports can be aligned, shaped, massaged into coherence before supervisors ever see them, but not today. Today, the military liaison had made it abundantly clear that every officer would deliver an individual account under federal review, meaning no shared phrasing, no coordinated justification, no we believed, no we assumed, no communal fallback. The sergeant distributed blank report templates, each officer receiving theirs like a summons rather than paperwork. Even the clerk, who had barely spoken, received one, because observation is evidence, silence is testimony, and neutrality can become confession if the timeline demands it. The younger officer, the one who first escalated from irritation to handcuffing, stared at the form as if it were written in a language he had never seen. It was simple: incident start time, officer engagement notes, recorded force justification, restraint justification, detainment cause, arrest protocol alignment. But simplicity was not mercy. Simplicity was exposure. Every line demanded factual clarity, clarity none of them had. He tapped his pen against the desk once, twice, then stopped because the sound reminded him too much of cuffs snapping shut. He wanted to write that she had been non-compliant, but his memory corrected him. She didn't resist. He wanted to write that she had refused to identify herself, but his conscience replayed her steady voice, stating her rank with unmistakable authority before he ignored it. He wanted to write that he felt threatened, but even his pride couldn't stretch that far, not when she never raised her voice, never advanced, never did anything except exist with posture and knowledge that he mistook for challenge. Across from him, the sergeant was not writing, he was calculating. He understood the structure of review more than the younger men did. He knew that federal oversight doesn't punish embarrassment, it punishes deviation. They didn't just detain a decorated officer, they detained her after proper identification, after lawful compliance, after confirmation. The real violation wasn't the cuffs, it was persistence. And persistence in wrongful detainment is misconduct. He pressed his thumb and index finger against his eyes, rewriting the story in his head, trying desperately to find a narrative that could survive a Pentagon audit. But narratives don't survive federal scrutiny, only facts do. The civilian liaison's warning replayed like a ghost in the air. You may want to begin preserving statements. Preserving, not drafting, not adjusting, not constructing, meaning they were already behind. One desk over, an officer who had barely participated in the arrest but had watched silently now realized what silence costs. He had assumed distance protected him. After all, he never touched her, never spoke to her, never commanded her. But oversight doesn't care about contact, it cares about presence. Witnessing misconduct without intervention isn't neutrality, it's compliance. His hands trembled as he wrote, because the only thing worse than responsibility is collective responsibility fractured into individual exposure. Bodycam retrieval began next. It was protocol, but today it felt like execution. Footage doesn't edit itself, doesn't soften tone, doesn't hide impatience or ego or the casual way someone said she thinks she's special. Video doesn't forget the moment the younger officer jerked the cuffs too tight, or the instant the sergeant dismissed her identification as irrelevant to detainment. It doesn't blur the moment she warned them, calmly, legally, that excessive force on a commissioned general could trigger automatic review. Most of all, it doesn't erase the smirk, the tone, the disbelief that crumbled into panic once her credentials registered. The sergeant sat at his desk, replaying the footage privately, each minute tightening like a noose. There it was, her calm, his condescension, her professionalism, his dismissal, her protocol, his ego. No outburst to blame, no aggression to cite, no civilian interference to complicate the chain of events. Just a straight, undeniable line from lawful authority to unlawful detainment. Meanwhile, internal affairs, not yet activated but already circling, sent an inquiry email marked urgent. The subject line alone felt like judgment. Request, preliminary STATMENTS, regarding high-rank DOD detainment. No exclamation mark, no accusation, just clinical expectation, a tone far more terrifying than anger. When the younger officer attempted to speak to the sergeant, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to unravel the panic tightening his chest, the sergeant raised one finger, not to scold, not to humiliate, but to signal that they were past casual talk. From this point forward, everything spoken is discoverable, everything verbal is evidence, everything casual can become confession. He finally wrote his own first sentence. The subject was stopped for verbal concern during directive response. Then he stared at it. It was dishonest, and worse, it was thin, a phrase that didn't survive even its own weight. He crossed it out. Second attempt. Interaction began following command resistance. He paused. It implied she resisted, but footage, protocol, and Pentagon contacts said otherwise. He crossed it out again. He sat still, realizing that there is a special kind of terror reserved for officers when authority turns back on them, not with fury, but with procedure. In the break room, whispers began, not angry, not defensive, but trembling. Can we get suspended for this? Will this go federal courtroom? What if she files Article 138? Do generals even need to file to trigger inquiry? What if the Pentagon presses misconduct through military jurisdiction overlap? Credentials dismissed. Force used despite compliance. Federal retrieval ordered. Oversight activated. In a media world addicted to sensationalism, this story required none. It stood by the weight of its own absurdity. And then came the cultural angle, one the officers never considered. Commentators began drawing parallels to other women in uniform who faced disbelief when presenting rank. General officers mistaken for assistants. Colonels questioned for ID more aggressively than second lieutenants. Women of color treated as anomalies rather than authority. This wasn't just misconduct, it was archetype. It wasn't just detainment, it was dismissal of station, of career, of earned command. Talk shows debated tone policing. Legal analysts debated detainment thresholds. Military historians debated the long-standing strain between federal and local enforcement spheres. Every debate moved attention away from the precinct's intended script, defiance and disorder, and toward the truth. Deference was demanded without justification, and compliance was punished anyway. Behind public outrage, a quieter storm brewed where it mattered most, inside military messaging channels. Soldiers, officers, cadets, veterans, analysts shared the story not with fury, but with recognition. They've seen this pattern before. Rank mistaken as attitude. Command mistaken as arrogance. Protocol mistaken as talking back. And suddenly, this wasn't a Twitter uproar. It wasn't a 24-hour news cycle. It was a case study, a bookmark, a warning. In the precinct, the sergeant watched all of this unfold not in real time, but in delayed horror. Screenshots popped into group chats faster than he could scroll. He tried to form a coherent response, but couldn't, not because he lacked words, but because every word was now potential evidence. The younger officer sat frozen as the narrative shifted from routine stop to federal breach of authority. His earlier arrogance, laughing at her rank, dismissing her identification, circulated now like a ghost only he could see. He finally understood. He hadn't just humiliated a woman, he had challenged an institution with deeper reach than his badge could dream of. As the evening unfolded, civilian protest wasn't loud. It wasn't even vocal. It was digital. Thousands reshared the silent image of her departure with no commentary, because the picture spoke its own indictment. The quietness of it was its power. No one needed to shout when the truth was scaffolded in plain process. A single trending headline summarized it perfectly. Power misjudged. Not abused. Not flaunted. Misjudged. The precinct had believed authority works downward. They forgot it also works upward and outward and across. They forgot rank isn't proven by tone. It's proven by system activation. The military didn't argue with them, didn't confront them, didn't retaliate. They simply arrived, documented, and left, with the person whose authority required no explanation beyond a call sign. And that was the moment the narrative flipped forever. They thought they cuffed a woman. They cuffed a general. They thought they detained an inconvenience. They detained command. Outrage wasn't born from violence. It was born from recognition. The country wasn't angry at what happened. The country was angry because it keeps happening. As the dust settled on the unprecedented events of that day, it became clear that this story was about far more than a single traffic stop or an isolated display of misconduct. It was about systems, about how power, when unchecked, can be misapplied, about how authority, when assumed rather than earned, can collapse under scrutiny. And it was about the quiet, unshakable strength of a woman who had spent decades mastering leadership, protocol, and resilience, only to confront an ignorance that assumed her presence was negotiable. General Amara Cross's response wasn't loud, and it wasn't sensational. It was disciplined, deliberate, and ultimately transformative. She reminded everyone watching, police officers, civilians, and the public alike, that authority is not a badge. It is responsibility, knowledge, and the courage to stand firm when challenged. For the officers involved, the incident became a defining moment. Careers that had once felt secure were abruptly, irrevocably exposed. The scrutiny wasn't personal revenge, it was consequence for bypassing procedure, for ignoring training, and for underestimating a person who outranked them in every possible sense. Every report they had filed, every word they had spoken, every action they had taken was dissected, analyzed, and compared against federal law, military protocol, and ethical expectations. Their narrative of authority, once unquestioned, crumbled in the light of objective standards. In that collapse lies a lesson for all of us. The misuse of authority, even when unintentional, has consequences that can ripple far beyond the moment. For the public, the story became a mirror. It revealed the vulnerabilities of those who assume power without understanding the weight it carries. It sparked dialogue about systemic issues within law enforcement, about how bias, whether conscious or unconscious, can escalate encounters, and about how respect for rank, professionalism, and procedure is not optional, but essential. People watched not only to see accountability unfold, but to witness an example of integrity maintained under extreme pressure. They saw a black woman standing resolute against intimidation, not with anger, but with clarity, lawfulness, and dignity. And for the broader military and civilian communities, This incident became a case study in how discipline and protocol operate as shields. It reminded officers at all levels that deference and respect are not just moral imperatives, they are operational necessities. Ignoring them can create consequences that extend well beyond the precinct walls. It highlighted the critical importance of training, of awareness, and of understanding that every citizen, regardless of race, gender, or rank, deserves to be treated according to the law and with fundamental respect. As we reflect on this story here on Swift Tale, we recognize the duality of lessons. There is accountability for those who misstep, and there is inspiration in the unwavering commitment to duty and composure demonstrated by General Cross. The power of procedure, of clear communication, and of unshakable professionalism is immense. And perhaps most importantly, the story underscores that courage does not always roar. It sometimes speaks firmly, clearly, and with the unyielding authority of truth. To our viewers, this is more than news. It is a reminder that justice is not passive. It is not merely about reacting. It is about understanding, knowing your rights, standing firm when necessary, and holding institutions accountable when they falter. It is about documenting, reporting, and ensuring that those who abuse power are checked by the systems designed to prevent such failures. So here on Swift Tale, we ask you to carry this story forward. Think critically about what it teaches about authority, race, gender, and accountability. Engage with it, discuss it, share it with others who need to understand the profound lessons it delivers. And as always, support this channel if you want more stories that explore the intersection of justice, power, and human courage. Like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already, and comment below with your thoughts on how we can collectively ensure accountability in our institutions. Because stories like these are not just incidents, they are catalysts. They are lessons that echo far beyond one precinct, one call, or one woman's resilience. They remind us that justice and authority are only as strong as the respect, knowledge, and integrity behind them. And when those qualities are upheld, no act of arrogance, ignorance, or misuse of power can prevail. Once the dust of public scrutiny settled, the procedural machinery of justice and oversight began its deliberate, unrelenting work. The Pentagon had already initiated an internal review immediately after the call from General Amara Cross, and by the next morning, both the Department of Defense Inspector General, DIG, and the Judge Advocate General's, JAG, office were involved. What followed was a meticulous, multi-layered investigation designed to parse fact from perception, procedure from assumption, and negligence from misconduct. For the officers involved, the moment they first realized federal oversight was active, any illusion of control evaporated. They were no longer part of the story, they were subjects within it. Every statement, every camera angle, every sequence of actions was examined under a microscope calibrated to federal standards. The investigation began with a detailed review of the precinct's records. Bodycam footage, dispatch logs, and radio transmissions were collected and cross-referenced with Pentagon communication timestamps. Investigators noted every second of the interaction, from the initial traffic stop to the moments within the detention room. Each officer's report was compared not just against official policy, but against the uniformed expectations of military protocol, civilian law, and constitutional rights. Discrepancies were flagged immediately, and minor misstatements were treated as significant errors because they revealed either poor judgment or intentional omission. Even casual phrases like, "she seemed defiant," were annotated as subjective interpretation rather than objective reporting. Interviews followed. Officers were questioned individually, under oath, and reminded that these statements were discoverable and could be reviewed across multiple agencies. The young officer, who had instigated the handcuffing, recounted his actions nervously, stumbling over justifications that seemed reasonable to him in the moment but were indefensible under federal review. The sergeant, once confident and commanding, now provided answers carefully, almost mechanically, aware that every word could contribute to disciplinary findings. Civilian staff who had witnessed the incident were also interviewed to ensure the narrative was corroborated from all angles. What became evident early on was that internal cohesion among the officers could no longer protect them. Their stories diverged naturally because each had acted independently, influenced by ego, habit, and misperception. As the investigation unfolded, the severity of the officers' procedural violations became clear. First, there was the question of authority misuse, handcuffing a senior officer without probable cause, ignoring identification, and escalating force unnecessarily. Then there was failure to follow detainment protocol, inadequate logging of personal property, unapproved seizure of federal identification, and neglecting to consult supervisory channels before escalating the situation. Finally, there was a failure of communication, misrepresenting facts in internal reports, inconsistent statements, and attempts to frame lawful behavior as defiance. Each infraction, minor alone, formed a pattern of recklessness when viewed collectively, a pattern that federal oversight could not ignore. The disciplinary process that followed was swift and decisive. While federal law prohibits direct punitive action from the Pentagon against local law enforcement, the involvement of multiple oversight channels created unavoidable consequences. Complaints were forwarded to the city's Civilian Oversight Board, which initiated administrative hearings. Officers were placed on administrative leave pending review, effectively removing them from duty while investigations continued. Internal Affairs conducted simultaneous inquiries, and the cumulative weight of evidence made it clear that exoneration was impossible. The sergeant, who had assumed command authority during the incident, faced not only suspension but formal recommendation for termination. The younger officer, whose impulsive actions had ignited the escalation, faced immediate termination proceedings. Other officers present, even those who had merely observed, were subject to corrective training, reprimand, or reassignment based on their level of engagement. Beyond the officers themselves, the precinct as a whole faced scrutiny. Leadership protocols were examined, training procedures were evaluated, and departmental culture came under the spotlight. Experts noted that patterns of unchallenged authority, implicit bias, and habitual dismissal of civilian rights contributed to the incident. Recommendations included mandatory diversity and sensitivity training, stricter adherence to federal reporting standards, and implementation of direct federal oversight protocols for any future interactions with military personnel or high-ranking officials. The ripple effect extended beyond immediate personnel. The precinct was forced to reassess its policies, reporting structures, and relationship with the community it served. Publicly, the disciplinary actions were carefully framed to maintain confidence in law enforcement while acknowledging failure. Press releases confirmed administrative leave, pending review, and federal consultation. Media coverage highlighted accountability without sensationalism, emphasizing that oversight mechanisms worked as intended. Social media, while still buzzing with outrage, also amplified lessons learned, demonstrating that systems of accountability could respond effectively when empowered by law and principle. For the officers involved, the consequences were profound. Careers that had once seemed secure vanished almost overnight. Reputations, both professional and personal, were permanently altered. Legal advisors advised them on potential civil liabilities, and the psychological toll was undeniable. Interviews conducted post-incident revealed feelings of embarrassment, regret, and anxiety, not because they had been publicly humiliated, but because they had violated the very principles they were sworn to uphold. For General Amara Cross, the resolution confirmed the efficacy of protocol, preparation, and patience. She remained unshaken by the public attention, demonstrating that discipline, not dramatics, drives accountability. The incident became a textbook example within military leadership circles, illustrating how lawful authority, procedural knowledge, and composure under pressure can redirect misapplied power, protect individual rights, and reinforce institutional respect. Ultimately, Section 11 illustrates the breadth and depth of accountability mechanisms in action. From investigative rigor to disciplinary enforcement, from administrative review to public transparency, the story demonstrates that authority without oversight is unstable, but authority tempered by law, procedure, and ethical standards ensures justice prevails. And it serves as a warning, not just to the officers involved, but to any system that underestimates the power of knowledge, protocol, and procedural patience. Once the official investigations were underway and the officers faced the consequences of their actions, the story of General Amara Cross quickly evolved from a single incident into a broader societal conversation. People began to examine not just the encounter itself, but the underlying structures that allowed it to happen. News outlets, social media commentators, and legal analysts all grappled with a central question. How could trained law enforcement officers misinterpret a decorated officer's lawful conduct as defiance? The discussion moved beyond the particulars of this precinct and into national debates on bias, accountability, and the perception of authority in society. Many voices pointed to systemic bias as a key factor. Observers noted that women, particularly women of color, often face a double standard in authority. While male officers or officials might be afforded deference even when calm and assertive, women frequently encounter skepticism or dismissal. This bias manifests not as overt hostility alone, but as subtle, often unconscious misjudgments, moments where competence is questioned or professionalism is misread as attitude. The public debate highlighted how such biases, if unexamined, can escalate simple encounters into crises. In General Cross's case, her race and gender were unfortunately elements that may have influenced the officer's perception of her calm, confident demeanor. What the officers saw as talking back was in reality lawful communication, disciplined composure, and rightful assertion of authority. Social media amplified these observations. Analysts shared comparisons to past incidents involving women in positions of power who faced similar treatment. From CEOs in corporate boardrooms to elected officials in public offices, patterns emerged. Competence questioned, authority dismissed, and judgment clouded by assumptions. The conversation expanded to include systemic issues in law enforcement culture, how habits of unchecked authority, reliance on ego-driven enforcement, and insufficient diversity training can combine to create a volatile environment for those challenging the status quo. Educational institutions, military academies, and civic organizations used the incident as a case study. Leadership seminars dissected General Cross's response, emphasizing the importance of procedural knowledge, composure, and strategic use of chain-of-command channels. Civics classes examined constitutional rights, highlighting the legal protections that exist even for high-ranking officials and ordinary citizens alike. The incident became a living example of how knowledge, patience, and professionalism can transform a threatening situation into a demonstration of accountability and justice. Public forums and community discussions also addressed the role of oversight. Many citizens expressed frustration with the notion that local officers could escalate situations without accountability. Yet, the swift involvement of federal and military channels provided a clear illustration of systems working as intended. The message was clear. While local authority is essential, it is not absolute. Checks and balances exist to correct errors and prevent abuse. This incident reinforced the principle that authority must be exercised responsibly, and that even small acts of misjudgment can have profound consequences when left unchecked. For law enforcement agencies, the societal reaction prompted serious introspection. Departments across the country reviewed training materials, revisited protocols for interacting with high-ranking officials, and examined internal biases that might influence perception and behavior. Experts suggested implementing more robust diversity, equity, and inclusion training, as well as strengthening procedures for lawful engagement with all individuals, regardless of rank or position. The narrative of the incident reinforced that accountability is not solely about discipline after the fact. It also involves proactive education, awareness, and culture change. For the general public, the story underscored the power of vigilance, awareness, and the responsible use of technology. The viral spread of the incident was fueled by transparency, observation, and factual reporting rather than sensationalism. Citizens saw firsthand how lawful action, combined with institutional oversight, can correct missteps in real time. It also served as a reminder that authority and accountability are interdependent. One cannot exist effectively without the other. In the broader cultural context, General Cross's experience became emblematic of resilience, professionalism, and the assertion of rights in the face of systemic misjudgment. Her calm, measured response demonstrated that strength does not always require confrontation. Instead, knowledge, preparation, and strategic action can produce outcomes that preserve dignity while enforcing justice. Media outlets, leadership experts, and civic commentators highlighted her approach as a model for how individuals in positions of power, or those who must navigate authority, can respond effectively to challenges without escalating conflict unnecessarily. Ultimately, Section 12 emphasizes that the incident was not merely a local story or an isolated confrontation. It became a mirror for society, reflecting both the flaws and the potential of our institutions. It revealed how bias, unchecked authority, and inadequate training can converge to create critical incidents. Yet it also showed how knowledge, procedural adherence, and calm leadership can correct errors, enforce accountability, and set an example for others to follow. General Cross's experience provided lessons far beyond the precinct walls, offering guidance for individuals, institutions, and society as a whole on how to recognize, confront, and rectify misjudgment while upholding principles of fairness and justice. The ripple effects of the incident involving General Amara Cross extended far beyond the precinct, affecting not only the officers involved, but also broader law enforcement practices, military-civilian relations, and institutional reforms nationwide. Once the immediate investigations and public scrutiny concluded, law enforcement agencies began analyzing the incident as a case study of procedural failure, systemic bias, and the critical importance of interagency communication. Policy discussions emerged around three main pillars: accountability, training and coordination between local police departments and federal or military authorities. 1. Strengthening accountability mechanisms. The disciplinary actions taken against the officers involved highlighted the effectiveness of robust oversight, but also underscored the need for preventative measures. Agencies began implementing stricter reporting requirements and clearer guidelines for interactions with high-ranking officials. The idea was simple: if an officer cannot justify an action in alignment with law, policy, and protocol, that action should not occur. These reforms emphasized the notion that authority is conditional, not absolute. Leadership within departments encouraged officers to recognize the boundaries of their jurisdiction and the procedural channels they must follow when detaining individuals, particularly those with federal or military authority. Accountability was reframed not as punishment after the fact, but as an integral part of daily operational practice. 2. Comprehensive training revisions. Training programs were updated to include scenarios similar to the General Cross incident, with emphasis on respectful engagement, procedural compliance, and awareness of federal military protocols. Officers participated in role-playing exercises designed to simulate encounters with high-ranking officials, civilians asserting their legal rights, and situations that could quickly escalate due to miscommunication or bias. The goal was twofold: to prepare officers for real-world encounters and to cultivate an awareness of unconscious bias that could affect judgment. Diversity and equity training became mandatory, focusing not only on race and gender, but also on rank, authority, and procedural nuance. By embedding these lessons into the training pipeline, departments aimed to reduce future incidents where a simple misunderstanding could escalate into a career-ending situation. 3. Enhancing military law enforcement coordination. One of the most significant long-term outcomes of the incident was a re-evaluation of the relationship between local police departments and military or federal authorities. Previously, many departments operated under the assumption that interactions with civilians were governed entirely by local policy, sometimes overlooking federal jurisdictional nuances. The incident revealed the critical importance of established communication channels and protocols when dealing with military personnel or other officials with federal authority. Interagency workshops were organized, and joint protocol manuals were created to clarify expectations, escalation procedures, and legal boundaries. Departments also implemented liaison officer positions designed to facilitate direct communication with military counterparts when necessary. These measures ensured that similar incidents could be handled efficiently, transparently, and without unnecessary escalation. 4. Cultural and institutional change. Beyond procedural reforms, the incident prompted cultural reflection within law enforcement. Senior leadership encouraged officers to examine attitudes toward authority, rank, and professional respect. The story of General Cross demonstrated that professionalism and calm authority could neutralize threats and restore proper protocol. Departments began to prioritize a culture of humility, procedural respect, and continuous education, highlighting that ego-driven responses to perceived defiance are dangerous and counterproductive. Officers were reminded that a commitment to justice, equity, and lawful conduct is more important than preserving personal pride in the moment. 5. Policy and legislative implications. The incident also sparked discussion among policymakers about clarifying jurisdictional authority and strengthening protections for federal officers when interacting with local law enforcement. Some legislators advocated for clearer statutory language defining how civilians and law enforcement should respond to rank and credentials in high-stakes encounters. Other discussions focused on ensuring that officers receive ongoing education about constitutional rights, military protocol, and federal oversight mechanisms. While no sweeping legislation was enacted immediately, the incident served as a catalyst for policy review, reinforcing the importance of coordination between local, state, and federal systems. 6. Broader lessons for society. Finally, the long-term implications of the incident extend beyond law enforcement and military institutions to society at large. The story underscored that systems work when individuals are prepared, informed, and willing to engage with authority responsibly. It highlighted the dangers of assumptions based on race, gender, or perceived social position, and it showed how knowledge, procedural adherence, and composure can counteract bias and prevent escalation. Public awareness of the case led to discussions about civic rights, the importance of documentation, and how individuals can assert authority or protect themselves in institutional encounters without resorting to conflict. Ultimately, Section 13 illustrates that the consequences of the incident were not confined to the precinct or the officers involved. It became a catalyst for systemic reform, cultural reflection, and interagency cooperation. Departments across the country reevaluated policies, trained officers on procedural and interpersonal skills, and prioritized accountability at every level. Military law enforcement relations improved through clearer communication channels, and society gained a model of how authority exercised with knowledge, restraint, and legality can redirect misapplied power effectively. General Amara Cross's experience served as both a warning and an example, a reminder that authority, when respected and understood, maintains order, and that ignorance of protocol, unchecked ego, or bias can have consequences far beyond a single encounter. The incident left a permanent imprint on institutions, demonstrating that meaningful reform arises not from outrage alone, but from the disciplined application of law, leadership, and procedural integrity. While the incident had immediate consequences for the officers involved and the precinct, its impact on General Amara Cross was profound in a different sense. She emerged from the event not only unscathed professionally, but as a symbol of resilience, composure, and unwavering adherence to principle. For someone accustomed to navigating high-pressure situations, the experience reaffirmed the importance of discipline, protocol, and measured response, qualities she had cultivated over decades of military service. Yet, beyond personal affirmation, the incident shaped her role as an exemplar for leadership, particularly for women and marginalized individuals in positions of authority. Initially, General Cross processed the event with characteristic calm. She recognized that anger or dramatic confrontation would achieve little. Instead, she focused on documenting every detail meticulously, ensuring that the federal oversight process had clear, unassailable evidence of proper conduct. Her approach reflected not ego or desire for retribution, but a commitment to institutional integrity and the principles of justice. By handling the situation through the appropriate channels, she not only preserved her professional reputation, but also demonstrated a blueprint for lawful and effective action in high-stress encounters. In the public sphere, her composed response became a source of admiration and inspiration. Media outlets highlighted her professionalism, noting that she did not seek publicity or revenge, but acted in accordance with her training and ethical standards. For women in leadership, particularly women of color, the story resonated deeply. Many individuals who had faced similar instances of bias or dismissal recognized in General Cross a model for navigating authority with grace and precision. The narrative emphasized that courage does not always manifest through confrontation. Sometimes, it is the quiet assertion of rights, knowledge, and preparation that produces the most impactful results. The incident also prompted her to engage with educational and leadership initiatives. She participated in seminars and panels, sharing her experiences and insights on professional conduct, crisis management, and institutional navigation. Her story became a case study in military and civilian leadership programs, illustrating the effectiveness of procedural knowledge, patience, and strategic communication in challenging circumstances. By framing the event as an opportunity for learning rather than personal vindication, General Cross amplified the broader societal lesson. Systemic challenges can be addressed through disciplined action and principled leadership. On a personal level, the incident strengthened her commitment to mentorship. She reached out to junior officers, both within the military and in civilian organizations, to emphasize the importance of integrity, preparation, and respect for established authority. Her message was clear. Leadership is measured not by how one commands others, but by how one conducts oneself when confronted with misunderstanding, bias, or opposition. She encouraged individuals to cultivate knowledge of procedural rights, to maintain composure under stress, and to assert authority through lawful and ethical means. Furthermore, the event catalyzed broader discussions about diversity and equity within institutions. Her experience highlighted the unique challenges faced by women and minorities in positions of authority, providing concrete examples that could inform policy and training. Organizations began to examine internal biases, ensuring that decision-making and enforcement practices respected rank, expertise, and professionalism rather than assumptions based on appearance or demographic characteristics. General Cross's measured handling of the situation offered a practical demonstration of how systemic biases can be countered without escalating conflict, providing both inspiration and instruction to institutions seeking reform. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of her legacy lies in the message of empowerment. By navigating an environment that initially sought to diminish her authority, General Cross demonstrated that preparation, knowledge, and procedural adherence can transform potential setbacks into instructive, even transformative moments. Her example reassured others in positions of responsibility that assertiveness, when grounded in legality and ethical conduct, is a powerful tool for maintaining order, securing justice, and commanding respect. As we reach the conclusion of this story on Swift Tale, it's important to step back and reflect on the lessons from this extraordinary incident. The events surrounding General Amara Cross's detainment by local officers and the swift intervention by the Pentagon demonstrate that authority, accountability, and professionalism are inseparable. What may have seemed like a single, isolated encounter evolved into a nationwide case study in law enforcement procedure, military protocol, and systemic reflection. It underscores a simple but powerful truth. Power without knowledge, preparation, and ethical grounding is fragile. Authority exercised with discipline, clarity, and respect is formidable. First, let's consider the core takeaways. Procedural knowledge is power. General Cross's experience illustrates that understanding your rights, following protocol, and communicating clearly can transform potentially harmful encounters into demonstrations of accountability and justice. In contrast, The officer's actions revealed the risks of acting impulsively, disregarding proper channels, and underestimating the knowledge and authority of others. Careers, reputations, and departmental credibility can unravel rapidly when authority is misapplied. Second, bias and assumptions have consequences. The incident highlighted how unconscious biases related to gender, race, or perceived demeanor can influence judgment and escalate situations unnecessarily. This is a reminder for law enforcement, institutions, and society. Awareness and training are essential to ensure that every individual is treated fairly, consistently, and with respect for both rank and legality. Accountability mechanisms, oversight, and interagency coordination exist precisely to correct such misjudgments. Third, the story reinforces the power of composure and strategic response. General Cross did not raise her voice, did not escalate conflict, and did not compromise professionalism. Instead, she followed procedure, invoked her rights and rank when necessary, and allowed the system to work. This approach not only protected her, but also ensured that justice was enacted efficiently, demonstrating that leadership and patience often speak louder than confrontation or emotion. Fourth, the incident sparked institutional reflection and reform. Law enforcement agencies nationwide reviewed training programs, improved coordination with federal and military authorities, and implemented policies to prevent similar mistakes. Cultural shifts were encouraged to prioritize humility, respect, and procedural integrity over ego and assumptions. The story became a blueprint for reform, showing that accountability works best when embedded in systems rather than relying solely on public outrage. Finally, for society at large, this story serves as a lesson in vigilance and empowerment. Whether as a citizen navigating encounters with authority or as a professional in a position of responsibility, understanding your rights, knowing your environment, and acting with composure and integrity are powerful tools. It reminds us that even when institutions falter, the proper application of knowledge, patience, and lawful action can create outcomes that restore balance and uphold justice. Here at Swifttail, our goal is to bring stories like this to light, not just for awareness, but to inspire reflection and discussion. Stories of courage, accountability, and institutional learning remind us that individuals matter, systems matter, and the choices we make in moments of challenge can have far-reaching effects. So as we close this chapter, I want to ask you, our viewers, what lessons do you take from General Cross's story? How can we, in our communities, workplaces, and daily lives, uphold authority with integrity and ensure accountability when power is misused? Comment below with your thoughts. We love hearing your perspectives and engaging in meaningful discussion. And of course, if you found this story compelling, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Swifttail. Share it with friends and family so that more people can learn from this powerful example of courage, protocol, and resilience. Your support allows us to continue exploring stories where justice, authority, and human determination intersect. In the end, the story of General Amara Cross is not only about one woman or one precinct. It is a timeless lesson on how authority should be exercised, how bias can be corrected, and how courage grounded in knowledge and composure can change the outcome of events in ways far beyond what anyone might imagine. Let this be a reminder that systems work when individuals act responsibly, that integrity matters more than ego, and that respect for procedure is a quiet, yet powerful form of strength.